Hi, I'm Jen Rogers here at Nasdaq Market Site, and you're watching Breakthrough Economy. In this episode, we explore the transformational shifts in biotech that are accelerating inclusive innovation in research, development, and the clinical trial process that could lead to greater equity in healthcare. I'm joined by Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath from the Biotech Innovation Organization, also known as Bio, and Dr. Melanie Ivarsson, Chief Development Officer at Moderna. So let's get started. And Michelle, I would love to start with you and talk a little bit more about Bio and why clinical trial diversity and inclusion is such a priority for your organization.
Well, it's a priority for our organization because it's a priority for our members. The Biotechnology Innovation Organization is a consortium of 1,000 biotech companies, mostly in biopharma, but also in agriculture and environment. And they all share a dedication to using DNA as really the backbone of their business. But in addition, they are really committed to making sure that the innovations they produce reach everyone who needs them and can benefit from them. And so having diverse clinical trials so that the public has confidence that our products and our innovation are going to help every segment of the population is an important step in that process.
Just talking about the public, I think for many, the pandemic really highlighted that health inequality is still a reality. So how has the pandemic added urgency to your work at Bio?
Well, the pandemic has really underscored long-standing health disparities in this nation and around the globe. And our companies are committed to trying to find a way to break through those differences and really bring quality care and solutions and cures to every patient in need. What we saw in the COVID pandemic was not just a huge difference in who got exposed to COVID, but also a difference in their interactions and experiences with the healthcare system and their accessibility to new cutting-edge technologies as they were becoming available. And so we know we have to work extra hard. We have to double down, as our companies did during our COVID vaccine trials, to make sure that we're delivering inclusive solutions.
So, Melanie, let's bring you in here because Moderna's COVID-19 mRNA vaccine trial was one of the most diverse clinical trials in history. So can you tell us a little bit more about how that came to be?
Absolutely. So when we started planning our first phase 3 clinical trial, and you have to remember it's the first phase 3 clinical trial that Moderna has ever run, we knew that it was going to be incredibly important to have diversity and inclusion at the forefront of our planning for this trial. We actually had to plan that trial unbelievably quickly. We literally were doing everything at warp speed. And we knew that we had to select sites that would have access to a diverse population. And we had to create awareness and appropriate materials for our participants from all different backgrounds to feel informed that they could enter into that clinical trial. Now, the industry hasn't done a terribly good job of this historically, with less than 10% of participants in clinical trials on average being non-white. And therefore, it was incredibly important to us that we did everything we possibly could. And the result was absolutely, as you say, one of the most diverse clinical trials in history, with 37% of the participants being from communities of color.
You drive home the importance really of the importance of having diversity in these trials, but what does it mean for future trials? And I guess more importantly, for patient outcomes?
So, the vaccines and medicines need to be developed so that doctors and patients know that that drug has been tested in someone like them. Gone are the days where vaccines and medicines historically have been developed in a subpopulation of the general population. It's important that everybody is included in the research process. And it's going to be really down to our industry to set very clear objectives, not just the pharma and biotech industry, the whole ecosystem. At Moderna, we've set very clear objectives for all of our clinical trials to ensure that we look at the targeted participant population, and we take that data and we actually have objectives around our clinical trials to ensure that we are going to include a very diverse population that represents the population that will ultimately be taking the vaccine or medicine. But on a global scale, we need to make sure that our clinical trials are run to represent the population at large.
So Michelle, in 2020, Bio launched the Bio Equality Agenda to drive meaningful change in the biotech sector. So where do you feel you've been most successful so far? And then what are the biggest challenges? Because it sounds like there are still some out there in collaborating with partners and member organizations.
Right. Well, it's early days still, but I will say one of the things that we've aided in, and we've been a part of this process, but I think many have participated, is raising attention of the issue. And, right now we're in the middle of a user fee legislation negotiation on Capitol Hill, which is basically the funding vehicle for the Food and Drug Administration. And clinical trial diversity is now a very commonly discussed element of that package. This is new. This legislation occurs every 5 years in a cyclical pattern, but this is the first time we're really seeing a huge concerted effort from lots of different stakeholders to make sure that as the government goes forward, it's supporting diverse clinical trials.
Michelle, we talked a little bit about the role and the need for trust, really, when it comes from patients. What is the role of transparency for this type of initiative?
Transparency is incredibly important. And what we found, not just with companies like Moderna, but with many of our other member companies who have had success in enrolling diverse trials, is that they start early. They get into the community, they have conversations with community leaders, they co-develop and design trials with the patient populations that they're hoping to serve. We need to make it easier to participate in our trials and easier to capture the data necessary to bring breakthroughs to patients. And so this early engagement is key, and it pays huge results.
Melanie, I mean, as we just heard, transparency also really played a crucial role in Moderna's vaccine development. How does it accelerate inclusion and play a role at Moderna?
Transparency is so incredibly important. In our COVE trial, our phase 3 trial for our COVID-19 vaccine, we were actually the first sponsor company to publish an unredacted protocol on our website. Now, everyone's thinking, what's the big deal? So pharmaceutical and biotech companies have historically kept that information very close to their chest. Only regulators and ethics committees and doctors have seen it. But we thought, well, why? Everybody should know exactly what this protocol involves, what we're asking participants to undertake. Everyone should see this. Each week, we put our enrollment information out on our website, clearly showing about the diversity information as well, so that people could see where we really were in a very transparent and honest way. We created some really interesting patient-facing materials that our sites were able to use, as well as bringing in community leaders and creating a diversity and inclusion advisory board. All of these things that we were doing were about increasing transparency and hoping that people would understand what we were trying to do in a very clear way so that they could inform themselves. This should be the standard of how we are running clinical trials in the future. And this is a whole new era for us. And I really think this will help us bring innovation through much faster as we're able to develop new vaccines and medicines.
And importantly, that extra effort of transparency and two-way dialogue also paid huge dividends as the technology was launched. So this is not just about diversifying the trials, it's also about having public understanding and accessibility to new cutting-edge science as it becomes available, so that we can shrink the delay that we typically see in technology diffusion.
I mean, it sounds like I've certainly learned a lot from this the last 2 years. I'd love to wrap up with a question for both of you. And Michelle, let's just start with you, because I'm curious about what greater equity in clinical trials actually means for the future of innovation in the biotech sector more broadly. And what is the biggest area of opportunity that you see? We've been talking a lot about COVID and the vaccine area. What do you see overall as the biggest opportunity?
Well, I hope we're sitting here 10 years from now saying that clinical trials are an antiquated way of capturing clinical data. Because what we really need to be moving towards is a way where we're capturing real-world data in actual day-to-day clinical practice. And we may use small targeted clinical trials to get that initial glimpse and sense of security in the safety and efficacy of new products. But then we make sure that we're learning along the way as we release products to a broader and broader catchment of patients. That will ensure diversity, making sure that we are capturing all clinical encounters and we know how all patients are responding to new therapies is the best way to make sure that every type of patient is included. So that's a huge shift. And we'll have to see, there's so much progress that's been made in a relatively short amount of time, that now we're going to see just an increased explosion, I think, of collaborations and dedication to this very important effort.
Melanie, same question to you. I mean, do you agree? And what do you see as the biggest area of opportunity given where we are now and the advances we've made?
I think, Michelle has made a really excellent point that the development of new vaccines and therapeutics has got to be where patients actually are in their lives, and we should be collecting the data through real world clinical practice. And that, she makes excellent points around the randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial is one vehicle, but the effectiveness of any vaccine out in society ends up being completely different. When it's given to a much broader population, you get new information that's really important. So I think the industry is moving in the direction, but it's not just the industry. Again, we come back to the whole ecosystem of regulators working with industry to come up with new and really innovative ways to develop treatments and vaccines, so that you can look at safety, tolerability, efficacy, and then continue to collect data out in the real world that will support that knowledge base. And increasing accessibility and trust continues to be a really important part of doing that.
Fascinating to get to talk to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Jen Rogers.